Here's an idea. Let's not get crazy.
Hi, everyone. I am Karen King, and I'm with my co-author, Wesley Smith, and we are writing a book, The Conservative Case for Psychedelics, and we're coming to you from our podcast, Sensible Psychedelics. And we thought it would be a really good idea to interview each other and have you get to know who we are and why the heck we're talking about this, and even why the heck you should trust us or listen to us. So we thought we would talk about our journey with psychedelics in the sense of what brought us into the space, and just invite you into our world a little bit so you get to know us. So, Wes, is there anything you want to say before I ask you questions?
No, I think the objective of this podcast really is for the listeners to get to know, and viewers to get to know us a little bit better, understand why we started the podcast, why we started the Substack, why we're publishing this book, hopefully within about a month and a half. And I think we jumped into this somewhat unannounced a week ago because of the White House executive order on psychedelics. And so we're trying to back up a little bit and get back to first principles as we officially launch the Substack and the podcast in this episode.
Great. Good. Well put. So I guess really the place to start is the beginning, is how did you get into the psychedelic space? What brought you in?
So about 6 years ago, August 9th, 2020 to be exact, I was paragliding and fell out of the sky. As we paragliders like to joke, the fall isn't what hurts you, it's the landing. And I hit pretty hard, broke my back, and through a series of, I had an operation on my back, fused the T11, T12, and L1 vertebra back together. And so as a consequence of that accident, I had a fairly traumatic concussion associated with it. Was what they call is a vertical concussion. And it led to very severe tinnitus, and also a phenomenon called hyperacusis, which is sensitivity to certain sounds. And after about 3 years of MRIs and drugs to calm down the nervous system, or the nerves inside my neck and my head, the medical establishment essentially fired me. They essentially said, "There's nothing we can do anymore. We've done everything we know," and so I started looking at other holistic alternative options, which led me to acupuncture, which didn't help. Did a lot of physical therapy, which would provide short-term relief, but not really anything meaningful. And then I had a friend who sent me a Reddit post that said, the title was "How Psychedelics Fixed My Tinnitus." And so I was getting all excited about this. And then 5 minutes later, he sent me another post that said, "How Psychedelics Made My Tinnitus Worse." So I was very confused, but I was also desperate. And so I thought, well, I'm going to give this a try. I didn't know anything about psychedelics other than I had just finished reading Michael Pollan's exceptional book, How to Change Your Mind.
Like everyone in the U.S. at that point
like everyone
was
else,
doing.
exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll come back to Michael Pollan in one of our other podcasts and read him the riot act about a few things he's been doing lately. But that's just a teaser for the viewers. But exceptional book. He's just an incredible writer. I've read all of his books, and so I had read the book. And what was interesting about his approach to psychedelics is that he had never taken psychedelics. Neither had I. He was 59, I believe, when he took his first psychedelic. I was 58 when, or I was 61, I guess, when I read his book. And so my trajectory was very similar to his. I was terrified of taking psychedelics. I was just an average person out there, average American, who remembers the ad campaign back in the 1980s that showed a frying pan, a skillet, and the voiceover, cracks an egg on the skillet, and then the voiceover in the ad is, "This is your brain. This is your brain on drugs." Get the picture. And so
Wes,
I
let
had
me
always had,
interrupt you just for a second
yes,
because you call yourself an average American, which I can see, like you're an average guy, but you're also a paraglider, not so average. But what's interesting is that you were reticent about psychedelics and even being an adventurer. So that tells me how well the propaganda campaign worked on you.
yes,
Yeah.
absolutely, absolutely. In fact, I not only adventurous, but I live in Park City, Utah, which is a very liberal community, and so I had been exposed to quite a few people who had already been microdosing, quite a few people who had already gone on psychedelic journeys. But in spite of all of that, the thought of losing my mind, literally losing my mind, if only temporarily, was quite terrifying. And Michael Pollan's book resonated with me because he describes in detail how he was also terrified about the prospect of taking a psychedelic leading up to his first psychedelic experience. And he describes later on in the book why that fear existed, some of it legitimate fear. Our ego is there to protect us, obviously,
Hmm.
and cautious by nature, but then also explanations of why he was afraid that had to do with his ego not wanting to let go of its monopoly position in his mind.
Yeah.
And so after reading that, I thought, okay, I think I can do this. And so I contacted a what they call medicine people, medicine woman, a facilitator who was hosting a group session of 6 people in a mushroom journey, a psilocybin a psychedelic journey. And so I went and I participated in that group session. It didn't help anything related to my injury. It didn't help the tinnitus. It didn't help the hyperacusis, but it opened my mind to an entirely different way of viewing my world, my role in that world, my relationship to others, and it started me down
Mm.
this path of a psychonaut, if you will.
Yeah. Yeah. It reminds me of Aldous Huxley and one of the psychiatrists, Humphrey Osmond, I think, who coined psychedelic. Is at the same, I just learned this recently. At the same time, they coined the phrase outsight, and
Oh,
which means a different view of the world through taking the psychedelic. So we have this insight, but we also have this outsight. And it sounds like, in a way, that's what you experienced too, is it helped open you up to different layers and levels that you hadn't really considered before.
yeah, I liked the analogy I liked, or the metaphor is I came out of my first psychedelic journey, and I think I'd mentioned this to my wife. I said, I feel like, I've led an interesting life, a fulfilled life, have 3 kids, love them dearly, a wife who I think loves me uh, as much as I do her. And, but I had felt like I had been, relatively speaking, sleepwalking through life, reacting to life's events rather than stepping back from those events and seeing the world in a much bigger way. And that first psychedelic experience really, it really opened me up to viewing the world in a much more expansive way. Not necessarily in a different way, but just in a much more expansive way. And all of these other possibilities of perception started to come into my life because of that broader perspective. It's almost like I was looking at the world through a camera lens that was not a panoramic, and
Mm.
once the mushrooms opened me up to an entirely different lens through which I could see the world.
Did it help your tinnitus? Not the mushrooms, but in general, did
Mhm.
psychedelics help your tinnitus?
Well, it's interesting. In a psychological way, it did, because even though I have never been suicidal about my tinnitus, it is severe enough to where I had and still have times where I can understand that there have actually been quite a few people who've committed suicide because they've had such severe tinnitus. And even though it's not a physical um, uh, phenomenon in the sense that, like, I don't get headaches from it and it's not painful, it's like having an ambulance siren in my head constantly, 24/7. And so, what the psychedelics did do, together with meditation and other interventions, if you will, the psychedelics helped me step back from the tinnitus and realize that I wasn't that tinnitus, that was a part of my life, but that there were other things in my life. And it's going back to this notion of a broader perspective. Just understanding that there's more in the world to be appreciative of, more in the world to live for, aside from just listening to that screaming in my ears that is there constantly.
Wow. I'm so glad you got at least psychological relief. And it reminds me of dealing with chronic pain. And that's what, like, mindfulness-based stress reduction helps with people with chronic pain. It doesn't lower the pain, but it gives you that separation. I guess my next question is, when did you first notice there was a particular political influence in the psychedelic world? So you went to this mushroom ceremony, and then what happened?
Yeah. So, well, because I live in Park City, you know, I'm kind of surrounded by people that are of a liberal persuasion. So I was already felt at ease in those circles. You know, yoga was another intervention that I jumped into as a way to help with this injury. And so, you know, even though I am a small C conservative, I started doing things that weren't typically conservative, like yoga. And so, to me, going to this hippie group, it was a little bit unnerving, but it wasn't. They were so it was a husband wife couple, and they were so charming. They came right out of, you know, central casting as hippies, and they were so accepting that I was able to fairly quickly get over any discomfort I had about being in a space that just wasn't me, and being with other people that weren't the kind of people that I would hang out with, because most of the other people were kind of hippie-ish, if you will, in that regard. But so I'm fresh off of that psilocybin journey. I did a much more significant journey about 2 weeks later with a psychotherapist. It was what's called a hero's dose, which was a very large amount of psilocybin in order to experience certain things that I thought might continue to help me on this journey of not only self-discovery, but also this journey related to my tinnitus. And about 2 months into this, I thought, you know, I was like a freshly baptized a Christian. I was super excited about what I had found. And I went over there was a conference being held in Denver. It was the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Science, MAPS. And they were holding their conference. It was their 2023 conference. And it was supposed to be the biggest conference they'd ever held. There were an anticipated 13,000 people attending. And so I thought, oh, this is going to be great. I'm going to go over. I'm going to be with my family of you know, other enlightened individuals. And I got there the first day. The plenary session had already started. I was a little late, so I ran into the plenary session. There were about 5,000 people. I think almost every seat was taken up in the convention center there. And Rick Doblin comes out, all dressed in white. And I thought, well, this is kind of interesting. Is he Jesus Christ? Does he think he's Jesus Christ? Of course, I didn't know anything about Rick Doblin. You know, come to find out, very charming individual. He talks about all of the advances going on in the psychedelic community. And then he said, in one of our keynote speakers I now want to introduce you to one of our keynote speakers, Rick Perry. And of course, I had known Rick Perry from my Republican days and my days working in the Reagan administration in the White House. And then obviously knew that he had been the energy secretary under the first Trump administration. And when he walked out on stage, I'd say maybe a third of the crowd booed him. And probably 50 to 100 people got up and walked out. And
I think it was more than that. I was there, and I think it was more. Yeah,
it could have been. It could have been. It was shocking to me. I didn't know what was going on at first. I was kind of disoriented. Like, are people evacuating because there's a bomb threat, or, you know, what's going on? And but the hissing and the booing. First off, I think hissing and booing anyone is tacky. It's just tacky. You know, it's like, you know, people didn't want to hear your booing and hissing. They came to hear the speaker, right? So as a kind of more traditionalist in that regard, I think speakers should speak and the audience should listen. and maybe politely applaud or not applaud at the end of the presentation. But before he even said a word, you heard the hissing, you heard the booing, and it was, I really felt it in my gut. It was like, a punch to the gut for me. And then I realized what was happening over the course of that day and the next 2 days in the conference is that if you were not, and of course, Rick Perry comes out and he's very self-effacing, and he talks about how, it's crazy that he, a Republican, is there giving a speech on psychedelics. Well, I later found out that Rick Perry has probably done more single-handedly than maybe Rick Doblin himself to advance the cause of use of psychedelics for mental illness and for wellness than any other individual. And here he comes on stage and he's booed simply because he was a Republican and a conservative. And, the old adage, if you got a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Once I had that in my mind, I started to see during the conference that if you didn't toe the line, a certain ideological line, which was decidedly left of center and in some instances quite left, what I call reactionary left, what we call reactionary left, you really didn't have a place in this organization, with the exception of veterans. I think veterans are a unique kind of and we'll talk about that more later, but with the exception of veterans' work within psychedelics, you really didn't have a voice there. And so that started me down this journey of trying to find conservatives in the movement, small c conservatives, right? I'm not talking a partisan partisanship here, but
is that what that means? Is that what small c conservative means to you?
Yeah. In my view, I mean, obviously our book is written to appeal to a large audience. I would say probably half of the American adult population, which would include people who identify as conservatives, small c conservatives who don't identify as conservatives, but they actually are conservative. They just don't identify it as, and libertarians, independents, normies, the kind of people that don't get invited to Burning Man, the kind of people that,
or like me, get invited and don't want to go.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Or the kind of people that get invited and they say, Burning Man, what's that? Because I probably, even though I had known what Burning Man was prior to taking psychedelics, mainly because I live here in Park City, it wouldn't be something that I would immediately think about going to, just given my age and my upbringing. So that, this is a long way around answering your question. Back to your question. I think that I think that started me on almost like a quest to find a tribe of conservatives. I went back to the 2025 MAPS conference and was still equally felt out of my element. And I remember running into one other conservative Christian who said, maybe you're asking the wrong question. It's not, where is my tribe? It's, how do I create my tribe? And that reframing started me writing this book, which I invited you into very early on, thank God, because, and I guess we can talk a little bit about how I met you, but with regard to the capture, what I continued to be surprised by was, no matter what retreat I went to, and no matter who I spoke with a few exceptions, I wasn't finding people that had the kind of values that I had. And I was interacting with a lot of people that I found to be good people, but their worldview was so different than mine. I never felt like I really fit in. And that's what sent me on this larger journey, or larger task, if you will, of trying to create that tribe that currently doesn't really exist within the psychedelic movement.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you reached out to me and that we got to do this together. And we're getting to do this together so we get to create and co-create that tribe, because we're out there. Clearly, we're not the only two. And ever since the executive order, there's been a lot of interest drummed up, and I've had a lot of conservative therapists come to me. So my next question has to do with faith and religion, because you've had the psychedelic experience, you've gone to the conference. How does your faith, religion blend into, celebrate? How does it stand in terms of its relationship with your psychedelic experiences at this point?
So I have a rather strange religious trajectory. I when in my early days, I was not religious at all. When I was 13, my mother was raised in the Mormon church, and so when I was 13, the missionaries, they have your records um, on the church records, and so they knew where we lived. The missionaries came by and visited. My sisters ended up joining the church, and then a year later, I ended up joining the church when I was 13, 14 years old. And the Mormon church gave me a lot of structure that I needed at that time, a lot of purpose. And I like to joke to people that I became quite a Taliban Mormon, which is I say that with all due respect to Mormons, not so much,
What's a
not so much
Taliban
with
Mormon?
Taliban Mormon, not so much with respect to the Taliban, but with all due respect meaning I was pretty hardcore. I was pretty committed to the religion, and because I was committed to it, it gave me a lot of purpose in life, and it answered a lot of questions for me that I had about life and my role in it, and. And when I was, I was an active Mormon from the time that I joined at 13 years of age until about 29, 30. I went on a mission to Argentina. And when I left the Mormon church, I left the doctrine of the church and the theology of the church, but the community aspects of the church and kind of those small c conservative values around family and responsibility, I didn't discard those. I just the religion just no longer worked for me, and
That was
so
when you're like 30, so you were there for almost
yeah,
20 years.
yes, exactly.
Wow.
And
Yeah.
so now at 64, 34 years later, what's interesting is that I left the church amicably, and half of my family members are still active, half are not active.
Mm.
And we always had a civil interaction about my leaving the church and my inactivity. But I didn't notice until after I'd taken psychedelics that I was, even though I was very civil to my family members that were still active in the church and to other church members that I interacted with, because I live out here in Utah, that there was always a bit of judgment in the back of my mind. And, there was a wall which existed between my Mormon friends that were believers and myself. But after psychedelics, I kind of I came to a different appreciation and perspective of them and their continuing practice in the faith that I hadn't been able to fully embrace pre-psychedelics. I know.
What changed?
Well, I think it was the ability. I think one thing psychedelics have done for me is they've helped me see the perspective of people from their eyes, and I think that's helped me remember myself what it felt like to be an active, faithful, believing Mormon. And in doing that, I was always when I left the church, I considered myself what did I call myself? Either a skeptical atheist or a hopeful agnostic. So I was in that space where my heart was telling me one thing, my head was telling my mind was telling me one thing, and my heart was hoping that my mind was wrong. But I think since psychedelics, I've been much more likely to question my disbelief and much more
Hmm.
willing to appreciate things that are mystical and which can't be explained by science.
Hmm. I like the way you put that question, my disbelief. I guess that's a really good segue into my last question for you, which is, let's say we get our way and you get your way, and that you started this quest in 2023 to find others like you in your tribe. When that happens, and conservatives, normies, unaffiliated, not ideologically captured left really start speaking up and being part of this movement and practice and the medicine, what's ideal? What will happen?
So So this will be the subject of an entirely different podcast between you and I, because you come to psychedelics from the therapeutic world. I come to psychedelics through what I call the DIY or underground, the do-it-yourself world. And my view has always been that for every person that qualifies for and accesses a therapist in a psychedelic session, there are probably 100 people that are taking psychedelics in that world of the underground world or DIY.
Yeah.
And so I think that psychedelics are a very powerful tool to help us in these challenging times we're in as human beings. And I think that they can be relevant for large segments of the population that currently are not accessing them. But I think that psychedelics only scales if there is a healthy, self-regulated DIY community. And I think that will not develop without conservative voices, without adults in the room, if you will, because we've shown, conservatives have shown that they can regulate themselves in various industries and sectors. And I think that if the government is too heavy-handed in how it regulates psychedelics, it will relegate psychedelics to the medical model, which would be a real travesty, not just because it would limit the number of people that could access it, but I think that the medical model, while very appropriate in certain instances, is quite limited. And being a non-woo-woo person, I can say that there's something about that woo-woo hippie aspect of psychedelics, the ceremonial side, outside of a clinical setting, which is very powerful, which I think you don't get when you separate the medicine from the overall experience. I think Michael Pollan mentioned it. He referred to it as imagine psychedelics as the placebo effect on steroids, which is somewhat a contradiction, but when you're in a clinical setting, you don't get that steroidal effect as much as I think you do when you're in a ceremonial setting, and you have a lot of the accoutrements of a ceremony associated with the medicine. So that the medicine's a strange medicine. It interacts. Psychedelics are strange because they interact with your mind in more of a collaborative way than a typical medicine would, say, that is to help you with high blood pressure.
Yeah, this is an interesting point because I think you and I disagree, but overlap a little bit on that, especially when you say the clinical model can't be as powerful as taking it out of the ceremony. I have thoughts about that, but we could talk about that at some other point too, and deepen
Good.
in that distinction between our approaches. So thank you for answering all my questions. And I hope that helped our newly growing audience learn a little bit more about you.
Good. So now it's my turn to ask you questions.
Yeah.
I'm off the hot seat now. So so before I ask you questions, I want to give a little bit of just background of how we met each other. I had just started writing the book and diving into this, and I saw you on a podcast, and I thought, oh, I've got to reach out to that woman. She's got some interesting perspectives on things. And so I did. And
I think the podcast was me talking to Leslie Elliott or her crew of friends on Solid Ground about the ideological capture of psychedelic assisted training.
it was,
Is that what it
yes,
was?
it was
Okay.
Leslie. Yes, it was. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
exceptional podcast as well. Yes, it was Leslie. And so of course, love at first sight, professionally speaking, of course, that, and so we started co-authoring this book, and the rest is history. So with that, my first question is, you used to be a hippie. And so I want to know, I've never been a hippie, even though I'm hippie adjacent, or I like hippies, but I'm not one, definitely not a hippie. So I'm interested, what does a hippie think? How does a hippie think? How does a hippie think? How does better yet, you describe yourself as both a hippie and also quite, would you describe yourself as having been woke? Having been liberal, woke?
It's such a good question, and I once we look back at this time in history, I think we'll have a really clear name for it. But I grew up in the art world. I was a dancer and in ballet and art schools, literally. So, and my dad was definitely a hippie. And so I was immersed in hippie culture and then went into art school, which was really, I think, the evolution of hippie culture. And so I learned all kinds of interesting things about experiential anatomy and that there were hundreds of different genders and there was no such thing as binary sex at my hippy dippy school. So they're kind of interchangeable. I think hippie and woke shift at some point in the 2000s and separate. So I think I was a hippie, and I probably still am. I mean, I dress like a hippie. Probably, you commented I'm the
Yeah.
most liberal dressing conservative you've ever met.
Yeah. You're the hippiest conservative I've ever met. Well, I'm glad you made that distinction, and I'd like you to maybe
Hmm.
parse that a bit.
Hmm.
The difference between hippie and woke, because I use
Yeah.
hippie in a very endearing way.
Yeah.
Woke, I don't use in an endearing way. I'm very concerned about what I think we call the reactionary left. Perhaps
Yeah.
you could suss out a bit of that in terms of your journey through
Hmm.
Naropa,
Hmm.
et cetera.
Yeah. So I went to this, I like to call it whacked out Buddhist college, where I learned and got a degree in underwater basket weaving. And I think that pretty much describes it, although it was a really great adventure and a great way to get a Bachelor of Fine Arts in dance. My minor was religious studies. And so I've always been interested in consciousness. And I don't think I didn't really realize that until I became a counselor and started reading more about consciousness. And then um, I went to a PhD program in 2020 once everything became online from the pandemic. And that was where I was really first introduced to woke. And so I had this experience of hippiedom from my Naropa undergraduate. Then I went to grad school in the early 2000s and accidentally fell into a postmodern, solution focused, reality is scripted program, and didn't know it at the time. So it was like baby woke, and we were learning
Is that like Baby Yoda? Is that a similar
probably
beginnings
not
of?
as cute, not as cute. Um, so it was baby woke, and that we were learning multiculturalism and how to talk to African Americans in a way that was different than talking to your Caucasian clients, and that's a whole other thing. But so I was introduced to that, and then had my career and opened a business and a clinic, and then decided after reading Michael Pollan, How to Change Your Mind, during the pandemic, that I was going to get my PhD, because at that time the thought was, when the FDA approves this medicine, they'll need a terminal degree. So I was like, I'm going to do this. I'm forward thinking. I want to be in that room, because I'm, I know this is the future. I was just certain this is the future of therapy. Even before AI came on the scene, I think this is the way to really preserve the human uh, inheritance of this medicine, if that makes sense. So I went to this program and was immediately confronted with pronouns for the first time and land acknowledgments, and had no idea what that was about, and was intrigued and also a little bit confused, and then very confused because of the the, the nonsensical nature of land acknowledgments. And I would try to joke with my friends in school, like, well, we should be acknowledging the meteor then, because the meteor wiped out the dinosaurs. And then let's go back all the way to the beginning. And they didn't really seem to agree with me or understand. And I realized don't think I don't think I really belong here. And I stopped the program after a year because the wokeness was too strong. And that was really when I started seeing the difference between me, maybe my hippiness, and what my field was doing, there was a huge gap. And then the George Floyd thing happened. And then I was being asked to look at my whiteness in the therapy space. And I was asked to decolonize my therapy practice. And that's when I really realized I did not agree with any of this madness that was happening and had to really question what I had been taught, what was coming at me constantly in my CEU trainings. And that brings me to the psychedelic assisted therapy training.
Interesting. Okay, so I'm fascinated by people that I have either read about or that I know or that I've seen now that have started podcasts that used to be left of center and have been canceled by the left. And I'm glad you're making the distinction between what we've historically called liberal and what we're now calling reactionary left, because I don't like using the word progressive, because progress in my mind means a certain thing, and I don't see the reactionary left being very progress oriented at all. They seem to be very reactionary and very authoritarian, and that is different from I think what we would consider historically liberal historically liberal mindset. And we'll obviously come back to that in later podcasts, because it plays into what we're all about. So okay, so this is interesting. So you're all of a sudden you don't understand all this authoritarianism that's surfaced within the liberal movement. You've had some pretty dramatic experiences in that particular area. Would you be willing to share a few of those traumatic moments of cancellation?
Sure. I mean, I think one of the most striking beginnings for me was when I was in a PhD class online with, I think it was, I don't know, research and statistics. And a person with a they, them pronoun appeared in the class with a giant stuffed unicorn next to them in rainbow colors. And they did the whole class like stroking this unicorn and snuggling up to this unicorn, and no one said a thing. And I thought, this is really odd. Am I in a PhD program? Like, what is this? And so it's that sense of unreality. Like, we are not occupying the same rules of civility and shame, healthy shame, which I think is important. And so I really started to notice that. And I think just me being myself in the world, I was interviewing potential employees in 2020. And all of a sudden, I started to notice in my interviews, they would ask me, what are you going to do to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion? And I thought, I said, well, I think if you do your job well, I'll really support you and promote you. And here I am coming from this merit-based, like, of course you will want to do your job and excel at it. And they were already putting me in this oppressor, authoritarian position that I somehow had to make their experience something, not what they were going to bring to the company. And so that was the first time I really realized, oh, there's a moral paradigm shift here between me and my employees, where before 2017, there really wasn't. I felt like we were really kind of on the same page. I was going to provide a great job for them. Hopefully they would stay forever. We gave them PTO and health insurance and all this. And they were like, yes, we'll work hard for you. And that really shifted dramatically in 2021. And so that increased basically that divide. And it was so confusing, Wes, because I kept being positioned as the oppressor in conversations, and it was insidious. It's not like there are a couple of overt moments, but one of them was being in a supervision session with an associate, and she said, oh, it's like that theory of Carl Jung or Jung. I don't know how to say his name, but it doesn't matter because he was an old, rich, white guy. And I thought, okay, this is a really different world. And the the people who founded Western psychology are being dismissed because of some Marxist oppressor oppressed class. I didn't have the words for it then. Now I see what
Hmm.
was happening. And so there was this divide, like if you believe that Jung is valuable, then you are somehow affiliated with the white oppressor rich class. And that just kept playing itself out over and over, where clinicians would complain about their paychecks and um, would not charge for no shows. And so it was
Hmm.
seen as bad if we were holding clients accountable for no show fees because we were the evil white capitalists. And yet they were really upset that their paycheck was lower and they weren't making this connection. So I'm just laying the groundwork for
Interesting.
the wackadoo that was coming. And then eventually they complained to the boards, they posted negative Google reviews, they did all the things they could to try to pretend, accuse us of being unethical when we were everything but it was simply because we were successful and ethical and therefore seen as oppressors, I think.
Hmm. So it wasn't so within this therapeutic model. Your issue isn't that they were criticizing various aspects of traditional therapy, but that they were criticizing it through this lens of because it was
Yeah,
developed by white people, it was inherently bad and
yeah,
therefore
yeah.
subject to all types of criticism and deconstruction.
And Wes, I mean, it's hard to really explain to people how bad it was and it is in the psychotherapy field. Like every class from 2018 on talked about pronouns and they them and inclusivity and all the jargon. And then it started to I guess it was 2019, 2020. uh, I heard whiteness is an infection in more than 5 classes I was in. And we're required to take these continuing education classes, which are basically propaganda machines at that point. And I was shocked that no one else in my class seemed to be able to recognize or could say, this is completely racist. Like, how is this okay to even say about another race? How are you not seeing this? It really felt like I had stepped into an Alice in Wonderland world where I
Hmm.
was seeing things differently than the my entire work community. So,
Interesting.
yeah,
Well, we're going to come back to, we're going to have
yeah,
a whole podcast just
hmm
on your therapy trauma because it's really, really interesting. Um, and, or on your trauma related to therapy rather. I want to shift a little bit around
yeah.
back to your journey, with psychedelics. So,
Okay,
because you come to psychedelics from a different perspective than I do, and you were much more into the wellness, self-awareness space than I was before you took your first psychedelic. So, could you
yeah,
describe a little bit about what you were doing in this area
yeah.
before psychedelics, and then what impact psychedelic experience had in that journey?
Well, I had created a clinic that was an integrated clinic. So we had acupuncture and massage. We were looking to hire nutritionists, dietitians. We had functional medicine, air, and peas. And so I was really trying to look at mental health from a holistic perspective and make that work in the world. I had never seen that. And we were all insurance based. And so it was really actually hard to make that happen, which is why I hadn't seen it in the world from a
Hmm.
business perspective. But I was really seeing the whole person. And also having been in meditation retreats, studying Buddhism for 20 years, like I understood that the body and mind are not two and not one, as the Suzuki Roshi says, that we are our mind and our mind is not located in our brain. I had been looking at near death experiences. So there were things that were really, I've been interested in consciousness since I was 5, really. And so these were things I brought into my practice naturally. And then I saw that ketamine was legal and after I read Michael Pollan, and I realized that we could add this to our clinic and really help a lot of people that were treatment-resistant depression, had been on antidepressants for years and weren't getting any benefit. And so I wanted to add it to our clinic, and I created the processes and procedures with our psychiatrist and psychiatric nurse practitioner, and then decided that it would be really important for me to do it if I was going to be working with people doing ketamine assisted therapy. And I have a history of trauma, so I qualify for the diagnostic criteria in order to have it prescribed. So I was the first one in the clinic to do it, and went through the protocol. And our nurse was nervous. It was the first time she was doing it, so her hand was shaking, and it was an IV. And so I had this experience where I went in as an atheist and came out having felt the presence of God, and that moment was big and powerful and transformative. But then the next few years of experiencing what I did really cemented me back into my core, I think my core beliefs, my rooted beliefs in Christianity and Western values, growing up in the South. My family's from North Carolina and Florida. So maybe I don't think I'm unusual in that sense. I haven't heard a lot of people talk about this yet, and I want to interview more who have this experience, but it returned me to faith versus propelling me into Burning Man, and I'm very grateful for that. I feel like I have a whole new experience of life, and also, so importantly, a lot of my trauma resolved from one ketamine session.
Okay, let me ask you a follow-up question on that, because
Yeah.
I've never done therapy before, but I've spoken to a lot of people that have done therapy and also psychedelic therapy, and the common response I've gotten from them is essentially, I did 3 years of therapy in one session of
Yeah.
psychedelic.
Yeah.
Somehow that it serves as an accelerant to have breakthroughs that may take a long time in a traditional therapeutic setting. So my question
Yeah.
is that essentially what happened to you? And if so, what was it? What was the
Yeah.
accelerant?
It was a series. There was the God feeling, which was, and I put my hand here because this is where I felt God. Um, but it was also images and hallucinations and sensations. And I saw it was a life thread. I had a red thread that moved through my life. And I could see all the points in my life, and I could see my family relationships and how they impacted me. And I had gone in with this idea that I would talk to ketamine and ask it to help me resolve my self-hatred, because that, was like a friend for many, many years, is this feeling of self-hatred and wanting to die. And I managed it. I did self-harming until I was probably in my 30s. And so it was a big part of my life. And so I went in with this intention, which is key, I think, to a successful therapeutic experience. And what it showed me was this series of events and images of why that happened and what the connections were. And for whatever reason, that allowed me to have distance from them, see them differently, which of course is what's thought to be happening in the brain as well. As more neurons and are making connections, we have more options. So I think that's what happened, is the storyline got really related to the feeling that I had. And then since then, I mean, it's been 6 years since I had the experience, and I've only had this intense shame or self-hatred maybe once, and not to the degree that I used to have it regularly.
All right. Well, we're gonna have a whole podcast on your ketamine experience, because it's I think that it's fascinating, and this is part of how we come at this from different angles. I don't I don't think that I had I don't think I had small t trauma in my life, although as a small c conservative, I would be that's something that I would say, right? Like, oh, I don't have trauma.
Mm.
Because that word, the T word, as I call it, I think a lot of conservatives are triggered by that because they think, well, trauma, that's what a soldier has when an IED explodes under his Humvee and his buddy, dies right next to him. But I think we all have, I like to, and I'm not diminishing that you clearly had trauma because I know your personal story, but I'd like to say I probably had a lot of difficult life situations that the psychedelics have helped me understand better and come to terms with better. But so let's shift gears a bit. So you go from a psychedelic experience, it becomes a mystical, spiritual, religious experience or spiritual experience, and what year was that?
2020.
Okay,
December.
2020. Okay, during COVID.
At the end,
okay,
the end of the year.
okay. So could you describe what are the similarities in the psychedelic assisted therapeutic world compared to the traditional therapeutic world in terms of your personal experiences?
Yeah. The world or the process of the therapy?
The maybe both. Maybe both.
Okay. Yeah. So let me start with the world of it, because that's really the topic I think that is so interesting to both of us, which is how to bring normie conservative voices into this field. Is that therapy is extremely captured by the left. In the education system, it is indoctrinated into people. We've got hundreds of stories now of grad students who were kicked out of programs, left programs, because they were told they were racist or homophobic, or told they needed therapy, or they were Nazis and were driven out, basically, simply because they were asking questions. So the therapeutic field is very captured by the left and believes that children are trapped in the wrong bodies, and that to say that they are not is conversion therapy. They believe that Trump is Hitler. They really have absorbed the propaganda that they've been given in school, and then reinforced by their community, reinforced by the ACA, unfortunately, the American Counseling Association, and even their clients that they're seeing. So it's very captured, and it is not open to questions, really, like maybe we shouldn't be focusing on race or oppressor class, but maybe we should be talking about mood and history and coping skills and resilience. So it is my field is very, they wouldn't see themselves this way, victim-based, and they're really invested in keeping their clients as victims in their victim status in whatever class they're in. And then psychedelic assisted therapy is even more honed in on that, because we have the indigenous piece. And in the model of therapy, if you are perceived as oppressed, then you have greater status than Western civilization or anything affiliated with it. And so it is an extremely captured field, psychedelic assisted therapy in particular. I gave a presentation, they asked me to, at the MAPS training in 2021 or 2022 that I was finishing up, how to add ketamine to your practice, because I was an early adopter and had done this. So I gave the presentation, and at the end, an indigenous elder, self-appointed indigenous elder, at the end of the talk said, "How will you indigenously source your ketamine?" And I thought, she's trying to make a point, I think, which is that the consciousness is the realm of the indigenous people only, and a certain type of indigenous person, because we're all indigenous people. We're all indigenous to somewhere. And so that's kind of a great example of the imposition of this strange ideology onto what could be a really ethical, powerful, Western medicine-based practice, ketamine.
Well, we're going to have a whole lot of conversation around the whole indigenous issue and the broader issue of gatekeepers and lineage and who actually owns these medicines, who should be making decisions about them. But you're touching on you're touching on some of the reasons why I think we got together and started writing this book. And I can't wait till it's published. I just keep thinking we need to publish it yesterday. So, well, let's go ahead and wrap up. I think this was a good introduction to our audience for both of us, having them get to understand us a little bit better. And we'll put in the notes whenever we have our website up and running for our book. We'd recommend that you go to our Substack, which is Sensible Psychedelics on Substack. And there we have longer form essays about some of the topics that we're talking about here on this podcast. So I guess let's finish off with one last question. Is there anything that I didn't ask you? And if there isn't anything I didn't ask you that you want to talk about, my last question would be, do you have any regrets about any of your experiences in the psychedelic world to date?
I think it was a good introduction. I don't think there's anything that you haven't asked me, and this will be a further conversation. And if people want to know more, they can read our book.
Okay.
But it's a good question. What do I regret about maybe my psychedelic experiences? Well, because I've had two. I did a mushroom journey, and I have to say I'm really not a group person. So I did it alone. And group has to do with my trauma too. So it's kind of understandable. It makes sense for my psychology. It's funny. I wasn't expecting to have this come up, but what I'm thinking is it would have been really helpful to have, I can't explain why I'm thinking this, but someone from my family share the experience with me. Like there's something about belonging to a family or a more experienced unconditional love. Like what if we grew up with the willingness and the ability to do this in our families?
Interesting.
I guess,
that's going to be one of our podcasts, which is what the challenges you face if you have a spouse, if you want to do a psychedelic, if you want to take a psychedelic, have a psychedelic experience, go on a journey, or you've been on one and your spouse doesn't have any interest in not only not doing it, but even knowing about it. I have a lot of friends that are that way, and there's some real challenges around that. You're making an interesting comment of what it would be like if you had a psychedelic family, essentially.
I mean, my husband was there, but he's not an enthusiast in any way. He's interested, and it was very supportive. But it would be different to have a psychedelic family. What about you? What do you regret of any of your psychedelic experiences?
Thank you for asking me that, because I was going to ask myself that question to finish off, because we'd forgotten about this question. But I think my only regret is the same one my wife has. And it goes back to the war on drugs and the egg on the skillet. Is both of us came out of our first few journeys just looking at each other saying, how could we have not known about this? We are fairly well-read people. We're book aficionados. We love reading about things. How could we have gone through our whole life and not really understood how fundamentally different psychedelics were from other drugs, like opioids? And not even knowing that, just lumping everything together. So I think my biggest regret is that I didn't learn about this when I was 35 and didn't understand how to incorporate psychedelic practice into my living when I was 35, and how I think the lives of my family and my wife and I would have been different if we had started earlier, because we're getting up there in years. But that's okay.
We're both,
it's never too late.
Yes, it's never too late. We're both kind of saying the same thing, interestingly, that we wish it had been embedded in our culture or valued in our culture or families earlier.
Yeah. And I think the disappointing thing was that it got the first run we've had in popular culture of psychedelics was unfortunately co-opted by or so affiliated with the anti-war movement that it
Mhm.
became a political issue rather than a health issue or a wellness issue. And, you know, as a consequence, we had the war on drugs, and we are where we are today because of that. But, well, I think that's a good wrap up. Any last thoughts before
Yeah.
we close out this episode?
No, I'm just grateful for everyone tuning in and listening to our stories. And we have a lot that we have planned to offer you, a lot of interviews, a lot of conversations, and we're open to any ideas, thoughts, questions that you have. We want to hear about your experiences as well, especially if you're a conservative, and especially if you're someone of faith and you feel positively about these experiences. We'd love to hear from you, and look forward to a lot more.
Excellent. Until next time.
Until next time.